Legends and myths, heroes and monsters. The days common folk had come to know were ones where that which was considered fictitious no longer remained so. The world as they knew it was coming to an end, and only a few could come to terms with that disheartening truth. Near the northern edge of Midland, a land ravaged by pestilence, famine, and war, lies a small band of travelers, of refugees who seek respite from the growing woes of their flight. They sit in unison beside the camp's crackling fire and idly stare into its flame, their minds drifting back to memories of better days. Allowing his eyes to wander, an aging priest of the Holy See shifts his gaze toward a man clad in a crimson robe. He watches in relative silence as the one before him carves a strange symbol into a neighboring tree. The marking was an ancient one, that much he knew, yet he could not determine where it was from. "What is that?" the priest called out, his voice breaking the still night silence. "Just a word, nothing more," the man explained. "It hails from the land of my forebears." "And its meaning?" The one adorned in a crimson robe looked back upon his handiwork, wrapped his fingers around the shaft of his spear, and gently tilted his head to the side. "Good luck, I suppose," he said carefully, deliberately. Though protection seems more apt. The old priest rose to his feet and with a firm tone declared, "You tread ground one could see as heretical. Do take care to remember that." Though the veiled threat was delivered in sincerity, the one shadowed in crimson couldn't help but laugh. He chuckled in a tone neither chilling nor wicked. In fact, it was playful, jovial even. The man seemed utterly unfazed by the accusation laid before him, much to the other travelers' growing concern. "My apologies, Father. I seem to have confused you," he uttered, taking a seat beside the others. Those who herald from the far north, barren lands which lay past the frozen sea, write in symbols that convey much, instead of letters which mean very little. "Yet you speak like a man of Midland," a soldier seated at the fire shot off. "That's because I am a man of Midland," the one in crimson explained. "The same, however, could not be said of my parents." "Why did you carve that symbol into a tree?" the priest questioned, unsatisfied with what he had heard. "Peace of mind," the man answered. "I travel quite often, you see, so I've taken to doing that whenever I get jumpy. Helps calm the nerves." "A personal ritual, then?" the old man asked, only to get a nod in response. Relieved, the priest sat back down and stuck his hands out toward the fire. He was duty-bound to investigate, and forced himself to do so despite his own desires. Now that the situation was resolved, he was content to leave it well enough alone, even if he still had his own doubts. From then on, the night ticked on by as it had before. The fire flickered faintly, travelers kept to themselves, and the sound of a gentle breeze echoed across the moonless sky. Though the world itself was about to be thrown into chaos, this single moment had found a calm only the embrace of death could rival. Then, like a stone shattering glass, a young girl disturbed the silence. She began weeping to herself. Not even a decade old, the child was pale, thin as a rail, and utterly alone. Her right arm was haphazardly bandaged in a piece of old cloth which had turned a bloody shade of red. She was in pain, but no one tried to ease it, let alone look to comfort her. "Will someone shut that girl up?" the soldier frantically barked, covering his ears. Beneath his hood's shadowed visage, the one in crimson raised an eyebrow to the individual's protests. The reaction was bizarre, extreme even, although in a more unconventional manner. Seeing nothing, but feeling the man's piercing gaze nonetheless, the soldier began to shout, "You looking for a fight?" Paying him no mind, the man in crimson, spear still in hand, rose to his feet and walked over to the weeping girl. Setting his weapon aside, he reached into a satchel which loosely hung from his waist and retrieved a small pouch. Pulling it open, the man picked out a single dried leaf from its contents and placed it in the palm of his armored gauntlet. "Eat it," he beckoned to the girl. "It'll help with the pain." The child did as she was bid, albeit rather reluctantly. It was the first display of kindness another person had shown her in what seemed like forever. Then, upon placing the leaf upon her tongue, the girl found herself in a state of shock as it rapidly dissolved in her mouth, the pain fading along with it. "Let me see your arm," the man instructed, his hands ready to take hold. The child did as she was told and let the one in crimson examine her wound. Peeling back the pus-covered excuse for a bandage, the man was greeted by the rancid smell of decaying flesh. The arm was infected and had begun to rot. Under normal circumstances, the girl would have to have it removed. However, she was no longer faced with normal circumstances. After giving the wound a thorough cleaning, the man medicated a piece of cloth and wrapped it around the girl's arm with a linen bandage. "Keep this on for 2 days and 2 nights, he ordered in a hushed whisper. "Come the morning of the 3rd, remove it, and give thanks to anything that seems strange, yet friendly." "Like an elf?" she asked with a quiet giggle. "Yeah," he replied, smiling. "Like an elf." Sealing the satchel and taking hold of his spear, the man returned to his place beside the fire. Unsure as to what exactly he just saw, the soldier began to stare at the one in crimson, examining him from head to toe. For a healer, a doctor, the man was exceedingly well armed and built like a warrior. It wasn't so much that he was big, hulking, but rather he was fit and athletic. Just from his physique alone, most would have difficulty surviving an encounter against such a foe. Yet that wasn't what the soldier found himself fixated on. The man's armor was odd. No other word could describe it. Seemingly forged out of a low-quality steel, giving it a dull, almost weathered gray look, the pieces which lined the individual's tunic were perfectly form-fitting, as if they were an extension of his body. It was unlike anything the soldier had seen before, a sentiment which was only reinforced as he noticed strange symbols, like the ones carved into the tree, faintly etched into it. "Never seen a healer so well prepared for a fight," the soldier stated. "It's become all too common, I'm afraid," the one in crimson began, "especially in Midland, after what happened to the wretched Dr. Dove." Silence befell the camp as the night's chilled breeze suddenly stopped. "Who's that?" the girl asked, uttering a question those gathered around the fire wanted answered. "Are you sure you want to know?" the man asked, fingering a rune carved into his spear's white shaft. "It isn't a tale for the faint of heart." The captivated group nodded in unison. They longed for a distraction, and this proved as good as any. Beneath his crimson robe, the one who would be a storyteller let out a staggered breath and set his weapon aside. Though his face remained concealed beneath the hood's shadowed veil, all those present knew he was ready to speak. Before the 100 Years' War's unlikely end, there lived a doctor, neither wicked nor cruel, twisted nor wretched, truly a dove amidst a flock of crows. As plague ravaged the countryside, the ever-shifting border of Midland and Tudor, this doctor, with a wife and child in tow, wandered the land giving aid to all those he could. It was his duty, you see, to alleviate the suffering of the dying, cure the sick. He was no opportunist, no vulture preying upon the desperate, but a man of faith on an important mission. Clad in robes so white they beamed as the sun shone down upon him, Dr. Dove looked to return hope to the hopeless. Embellishment aside, the priest began to grow uncomfortable as he listened to the one in crimson and his familiar tale. A man serving a higher power, the righteousness of his cause. He already knew how the story would unfold. Though many considered him able to do so, the man could not work miracles. Many still died in his care, yet they did so without fear. Be it the doctor's soothing tone or his wife's gentle touch, those that met their end found peace in their passing. However, as the years ticked on by, the man would perform a feat most deemed impossible. As if the hand of God was guiding him forward, he would save a life, but lose everything for it. After a horrific battle on land stricken with disease, the forces of Tudor sought the doctor's aid. The son of the army's commander, the son of a high lord, had been wounded and come down with plague. Ordinarily, the kind doctor would try to ease his passing. There was nothing to be done, yet circumstance compelled him to do otherwise. A patriot at heart, a deal was struck. If the doctor saved the Lord's son, then the army's prisoners, soldiers of Midland, would be free to leave. The soldier, gathered around the campfire beside his fellow travelers, began to nervously scratch his neck. He knew how this story would end, for he was an unwitting part of it. A brave man only dies once, he thought to himself, but a coward dies 1,000 deaths. The Lord's son was ultimately saved, and the prisoners were set free. Ordinarily, this would be the story's end, a happy send-off that demonstrates the good of man. Yet, it isn't, for there is still much left to say. Eventually, the good doctor would find himself in a small village under the rule of a local Midland lord. At this village, he would be pressed into service, where he was forced at the pain of death to save said lord who had fallen ill. Fortunately, his sickness was easily treated, and he survived. Unfortunately, he survived. Upon regaining his sense, the lord ordered the doctor and his family seized, where they were then promptly thrown into the castle's darkest cells. To us, this may not make sense. Why would he do such a thing? Well, you see, hate, the desire for revenge, is a twisted beast that can corrupt even the noblest of hearts. And this lord's heart was far from noble. Only the echo of the wind and the fire's crackling flame could be heard as the man momentarily fell silent. Everyone knew what was about to befall the doctor. They've heard stories of this kind before, yet they held their breath all the same. He was tortured, wasn't he? Asked the priest. To put it lightly, the one in crimson replied. The soldier, moving away from the others, halted his retreat as the man's shadowed gaze bared down upon him. He was to go nowhere. What did the doctor do? The priest inquired for all those still listening. The lord who had imprisoned him lost his son fighting Tudor, his killer being the commander's son, the man the doctor had saved. The priest stared into the fire and let his shoulders slump, seemingly in defeat. It was a cruel twist of fate. How could God allow that to happen? Was it part of his plan? A single piece to a larger puzzle? The old man couldn't tell. From where he sat, it all seemed so senseless. In a somber tone, the man picked up where he had left off. For Dr. Dove, the days that followed could easily be described as hell on earth. As you all may expect, he was tortured. The Lord's men removed his fingernails, cut off his lips, flayed bits of his flesh, and even castrated him. This, however, was not the worst of it. You see, this kind man had to watch as the same was done to his wife and young daughter both. Their screams and cries for mercy could be heard throughout the castle. It said the soldier who stood guard as this happened made a habit of drinking himself into a stupor and passing out in the neighboring village's stables. The man looked toward the other end of the fire, at the soldier who sat across from him. He then paused for but a moment before resuming. The doctor's wife and child would not survive their ordeal. However, the same could not be said of the doctor himself. Hatred burned within his heart. It kept him alive. He would have his revenge. That much he vowed. Satisfied and no longer finding enjoyment from torture alone, the Lord sought to kill the doctor in a way he viewed as fitting. After he tarred and feathered this once kind man, the Lord placed him in a field, only to then set him alight. He watched as the doctor screamed his last screams and ran toward a distant river, seemingly in vain. He would collapse before reaching it. However, this too is not the end of our story. This man, now wretched and deformed, crawled by the skin of his fingers toward the river which lay before him. He reached it, let it carry him to wherever it flowed, and awoke upon its banks with a strange egg-like stone lying beside him. Grasping it between his charred fingers, he realized this most precarious stone had malformed human features. It served as a reminder of sorts of all that which had happened to him, and he swore vengeance. Donning the broken remains of his beaked mask and the blood-red robes that were once a vibrant shade of white, the wretched Dr. Dove would do unto his captors that which was done unto him. "Wait, I've heard of this," the priest interjected. "A lord and the entirety of his court were massacred over the span of several years, each victim more brutalized than the last." "Not the whole court, father," the one in crimson added. "One man survived, the guard who watched the horrific wrongdoings inflicted upon the doctor and his family." The soldiers still seated beside the fire desperately wanted to stand, to flee from the one everyone else viewed as a mere storyteller. Yet he couldn't. He believed that if he did so, he would not survive the night. I'll spare the details of the killings for the young ones among us. However, it cannot be understated how cruel each one was. The pain the doctor felt both on his body and within his heart was inflicted tenfold upon those who wronged him. Then, at the edge of Midland, near a cottage few would pay mind to, the wretched Dr. Dove would set aside his quest and do that which he didn't expect: act as a doctor. Panicked and without knowing any better, a young boy approached the man as he passed by his home. He begged the doctor for his help. His mother was dying and he didn't know what to do. Taking pity upon the boy, or perhaps acting upon instinct, Dove set aside his quest and would spend many a winter looking after the now parentless child. He would go on to raise the boy in place of the daughter he had lost, and teach him all that there was to know about medicine. The girl, taking great care not to move too quickly, perked her head up and looked toward the one in crimson. Moving his finger to his lips, the man looked to the child. "Come now," he uttered. "We mustn't spoil the end." Returning the gesture in kind, the excitable young child remained silent and returned to listening intently. Finding a newfound purpose, or perhaps embracing utter carelessness, the wretched Dr. Dove, with his blood-soaked robes, began to wander the countryside once more, giving aid to those that would let him. Like before, however, he wasn't alone. The boy who lost his mother had chosen to follow wherever he may lead. Together, they healed the sick, comforted the dying, and extended a hand to those who desperately needed it. This, as you may imagine, did not last long. As the pair entered a village consumed by pestilence, they were beset by soldiers of Midland, and the very lord who had ruined Dr. Dove's life. There was no fight, no gallant last stand, for neither the doctor nor child were warriors. Pinned, with their faces buried into the dirt, they were at the Lord's mercy, and the Lord refused to make the same mistake twice. He would have both of their throats cut, despite Dove's desperate pleas. Then, as the knife's cold steel pressed against the doctor's leathered skin, the unthinkable happened. The egg-like stone which the doctor had kept on him fell out of his pocket and formed a face out of its misplaced features. It began to wail and cry tears of blood. It warped the landscape from something familiar into that which few could comprehend. The Lord, his soldiers, and the pair at his mercy were in hell, with the 4 wretched demons of an unfinished hand looking down upon them. A wish, a foul being uttered atop the hand's thumb. That is what lays before you. All your desires will become reality, a lustful woman tempted, her fingers running down the length of her breast. Revenge for a lover, a small entity squawked. Retribution for a daughter, a gluttonous creature croaked. The Lord's soldiers could not believe the sight before them. They dropped their weapons and fled, never to be seen again. This is preposterous, the priest howled, springing to his feet. How dare you utter such blasphemy? The one in crimson dropped his calm demeanor and rose from his spot beside the fire. Father, I suggest you sit back down. The man spit, his words like ice. You know of what I speak. You've seen their servants for yourself, and they're the reason you're on the run. The old man began to tremble. You presume to order me, a man of God. I presume nothing, yet if you flee, I know you will not last the night. A glimmer of red flashed beneath the man's hood. His words were no mere threat. Sit back down, ordered the one in crimson. There is still much left to say, and we're running out of time. Like a whipped dog, the priest returned to his place beside the fire. However, the man remained upright. He was fingering his spear's leather wrapping. He was anxious. A fight was looming on the horizon. The unfinished hand's insidious demons looked to Dr. Dove and proclaimed he, like all of us, was without free will. His choices were meaningless, that his life was preordained to play out as it had since his birth. The wish which laid before him was his destiny coming to fruition. He would have the power to take revenge upon all those that wronged him, be it the Lord before him or even the King of Midland. Still on his knees, the boy looked to the good doctor and saw that he was lost in thought. His hands were trembling, his head twitching. He desperately wanted that wish to become a reality, yet, deep within his heart, he knew it would not be without cost. A precious sacrifice proclaimed the thumb's void. That would be all which is required. The doctor grew silent, remained motionless. He now understood the cost and looked toward the boy kneeling beside him. Then, after a period of deafening silence, Dove looked toward the unfinished hand and let out a wicked laugh. Don't you see? Hate. It rhymes with fate, he explained to the beings before him, his words dripping with amusement. Isn't that funny? Again, the good doctor let out a laugh so wretched and twisted, venomous and cruel, it chilled the blood of all those there still considered human. He had come upon a grand revelation. For but a moment, the man in crimson stopped and raised a finger to his veiled eye. A single drop of blood had fallen from it. The time was near at hand. The doctor howled and roared, giggled and cackled for what seemed like an eternity. What a joyous day, he finally uttered beneath a chuckle. I have found those deserving of my ire. There was to be no sacrifice, no deal. Whatever those of the unfinished hand desired would not be had that day. The doctor denied them. For that, he would pay with his life. A gaping gash which ran across Dove's neck tore open and began spewing blood. Those beings kept the soldier's handiwork at bay. They no longer had a reason to do so. Then, as the good doctor writhed in pain, desperately clawing at his own throat, the souls trapped within hell's frigid embrace unhooked their jaws and screamed. The landscape began to warp and bend. Sights of horror began giving way to that which was familiar. For the boy and Lord both, however, this transition was not a kind one. Their eyes rejected the twisted images of evil that lay before them, and so they began to bleed. "Come now. You mustn't look away," the doctor faintly ordered as he pointed away from the boy. In a panic, the Lord had blinked as he stared into hell's closing abyss and went blind. The doctor had done the same, and he wished the boy a different fate. Forcing his eyes to remain open, the boy's vision began to blur and fade until he saw nothing but a vibrant shade of red. Again, the one in crimson stopped his tail and looked toward the darkening horizon. The wind now blew toward the ancient tower of conviction. Standing above the doctor's corpse, the boy had found himself in a world he thought he understood. Listening to the Lord's pathetic whimpers, he began to contemplate everything. Nothing was the same. He could no longer live a normal life. He had stared into that abyss, and it changed him. Grabbing the knife which was held to his throat, the one few could still call a child walked over to the Lord as he crawled helplessly on the ground. He thought of killing him, doing unto that miserable piece of shit that which was done to the doctor, yet he didn't, or perhaps couldn't. Burying what remained of a good man, the boy laid the wretched Dr. Dove to rest and brought an end to his sad tale. Though he was not without fault, he demonstrated to those who thought us weak the true strength of humanity. "What happened to the boy?" the girl asked, a cold wind forcing her closer to the fire. "The boy?" the one in crimson mused. "He ventured north, as far north as one could go, and he found his own path." "And what exactly is that path?" the soldier finally asked. "Revenge?" All those gathered around the fire could tell the soldier was terrified. He was trembling, and his words were barely audible. "Revenge," the man pondered, much to his own amusement. "No, not revenge. It's a pointless endeavor which only means to further their ends. What's done is done. Let it go." The one in crimson looked back and smiled a shining grin beneath his hood. The soldier had nothing to fear from this man. That much he now finally knew. "Don't tell me you mean to fight those monsters," the priest shouted, the fear beneath his eyes plain for all to see. "I do," the man replied simply. "You can't win," he cried out. "No one can. It's impossible." With a gauntlet, cold to the touch, the one in crimson placed a hand upon the priest. "Have a bit of faith, Father," he comforted. "If not in God, then in your fellow man. They might surprise you." Removing his hand from the old man, the one in crimson began wiping away blood that had come to drench his face. It poured out of his eyes, which glowed a faint shade of red beneath his hood at a rapid pace. "Seems it's about that time again," he remarked, reaching into his satchel. The man retrieved a metal mask which bore the shape of a bird and placed it upon his face, his mouth still visible beneath the hood's crimson robe. "No matter what happens, nobody is to leave this camp until the sun has risen," the man warned. "You will die if you do otherwise." Distantly, standing atop the crest of a hill, the band of travelers began to spot the silhouette of a creature none could describe as an animal, let alone a man. Leaving behind the fire's flickering light, the one in crimson stepped into darkness and raised his spear toward the approaching figure. He then began to utter words in a language foreign to all, and pounded the shaft of his weapon into the earth, prompting a torrent of light to erupt out of that tree which he had carved into. This immense discharge of energy began to spread out across the sky and formed a dome which encircled the camp's perimeter. Paying close attention, the girl realized there were several other symbols, runes, like the one etched into the tree which were traced into the dirt. They glowed a cold shade of blue and radiated a power none present could deny. "Ancestors of old, spirits still adrift, "Heed my call and fulfill your oath," the one in crimson shouted, his robes bellowing behind him against the wind's growing current. A calm night sky suddenly gave way to a howling gale and roaring blizzard. Snow tore into the landscape with vicious abandon and unrelenting speed, ripping apart the entire countryside, save for where those huddled beside the fire tread. Then, from the snowfall's growing haze emerged a fur-covered beast that inched forward, little by little, step by step, upon all fours. Nature's barrage did little to deter the creature from its course, however. It would not be felled nor frightened so easily. Standing before the one in crimson, the monster opened its large, vacant eyes of black and smiled a toothy grin. The beast was a being cruel and sadistic. It thought to toy with the man which stared him down. It did not yet grasp the folly of its decision. Hearing the crunch of snow beneath his boot, the one in crimson ripped his spear from the depths of the earth and made a declaration none could decipher. His armor, normally a dull shade of gray, then illuminated the night's chaotic backdrop as it donned a vibrant white hue. Paying little regard for his own life, the man, shining bright, plunged into darkness toward the monster before him. The blizzard's ceaseless downpour continued unabated as the pair closed the distance upon one another. With claws sharper than a razor, the monster leapt at the one in crimson and swiped like a cat batting at its prey. Fearless and with steady hands, the man chucked his spear at the foe before him, striking true. The weapon's cold steel then pierced through the creature's paw, embedding itself into the countryside's frigid depths. Letting not a good opportunity go to waste, the one in crimson tackled the beast, digging in his heels, and began driving it back. His strength was unlike anything the monster had encountered before. Legends of the Black Swordsman aside, this seemed unnatural. Wrong. Then, with fingers firm and precise, the man jammed his hand into the creature's socket, plucking out its eye. Roaring in pain, the monster responded in kind by striking its foe just above the belt, sending him flying across the land and into its frozen embrace. Landing back first, the one in crimson began spitting up blood as he desperately tried rising to his feet. Bones had been broken, an organ pierced. The act of standing was one which had become much too daunting. Placing a hand behind him, the man began to utter words in an ancient tongue that brought his armor to life. The runes etched into its vibrant white metal began to shine an audacious shade of red. Ice sprung forth out of the land and then wrapped itself around the one who called upon it. That which was broken, what was pierced, had been mended for but the time being only. There was no longer any warmth which flowed through the man's veins, only the frigid sting of vindictive spirits who would not see him defeated so easily. The creature, pushing itself against the raging blizzard, thundered toward the man standing tall. It could feel his intense gaze, the one in crimson's sense of purpose, his strength of will. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, the beast had found itself afraid. Extending an arm out toward his foe, the man called upon his weapon to return, and it would heed this command. The runes etched into its shaft shining proudly, the spear shot through the air and found itself once more in its master's firm grasp. With the beast now bearing down upon him, the man, prideful in his defiance, raised the cold steel tip of his weapon and plunged it into his foe's gaping maw. Allowing no time go to waste, the one in crimson rammed his fist into the creature's vacant socket and compelled spirits with business yet unfinished to see their debt settled. Ice began to envelop the void where the monster's eye used to reside, and before long, engulfed its entire head. In a single, swift motion, the man retrieved his spear from the monster's mouth and brought it to bear down upon his foe. The weapon's shaft then smashed into the creature and shattered its brittle skull. Morning would come for the small band of travelers. However, that peculiar individual would not return. He had a journey of his own, a path before him which laid yet unfinished. Though the man in crimson was without a name, those he came across would come to call him Dr. Dove, a fitting name they found, for one wishing to rid the world of its rot.